She was standing in her garden, pruning roses, when she saw the police car slow down in front of her house. She didn't panic. Not immediately. She had learned, over 22 years, how to control her face, how to breathe evenly, how to smile at the right moment, and cry at the right moment, and look confused when confused was what people expected. She watched the officer step out of the car. She waved. He waved back. And then he started walking up her driveway. And that's when Patricia Marlowe felt the first cold thread of fear she had felt in over 2 decades. Welcome to StoryLabs. Today, we're telling you the story of a woman who got away with murder. Not once, not twice, but in a way so calculated, so disturbingly patient, that investigators who later reviewed the case said, and I'm not exaggerating here, that she may have been one of the most controlled killers they had ever encountered. This is the story of Patricia Marlowe, wife, mother, neighbor, volunteer at the local church bake sale, and, as it turned out, a murderer who had been hiding in plain sight for 22 years. Let's go back to the beginning. It was 1998. A small, unremarkable town called Harlan's Creek in rural Ohio. Population, just under 4,000 people. The kind of place where everybody knew your name, your business, your grandmother's maiden name, and what you had for dinner on Tuesday. Patricia Webb was 29 years old at the time. Brown hair, quiet eyes. The kind of woman people described as pleasant, but never remarkable. She had grown up in Harlan's Creek, gone to school there, and never really left. She married Douglas Marlowe in 1994, a local contractor, 10 years her senior, a solid and dependable man who loved fishing and hated conflict. By all accounts, the marriage was fine. Not passionate, not miserable, just fine. But Patricia had always wanted more. Not money, not fame, not even romance, exactly. Patricia wanted control. And control, in the life she was living, felt very far away. She had a sister-in-law she couldn't stand, a husband who dismissed her ideas, a mother-in-law who made passive-aggressive comments about her cooking every Sunday dinner, and a quiet, suffocating sense that her life was not her own. She started keeping a journal in 1997, and in that journal, according to investigators who would later read every single page, she was writing things that no one around her would have believed. Now, we need to talk about Douglas Marlowe's brother. His name was Raymond. Raymond Marlowe, 41 years old in 1998, divorced, and the person who stood to inherit a significant portion of the Marlowe family property if Douglas died without a will. And Douglas, as it happened, had not yet written a will. In January of 1998, Douglas Marlowe fell ill. It started as fatigue, then stomach pain, then a strange, persistent weakness that his doctor initially attributed to stress and a poor diet. By March, Douglas was dead. He was 43 years old. The official cause of death was listed as acute gastrointestinal failure secondary to a bacterial infection. His doctor noted that Douglas had been in generally poor health and that these things, unfortunately, happened. The town mourned. Patricia cried at the funeral. Beautifully, someone later said, tears at exactly the right moments. And then, 6 months later, she married Raymond. Yes, you heard that correctly. 6 months after burying her husband Douglas, Patricia Marlowe married his brother, Raymond. The town talked. Of course the town talked. This was Harlan's Creek. People talked about you if you wore the wrong color shirt to the grocery store. Some people thought it was scandalous. Some thought it was grief doing strange things. Raymond's friends were quietly unsettled, but Raymond himself seemed happy, besotted even. He had always been fond of Patricia, he told people. Always thought Douglas didn't appreciate her enough. And Patricia, well, Patricia seemed transformed. Lighter, more confident. She redecorated the house, started a small catering business, joined the church committee, volunteered at the school. She was, as far as Harlan's Creek was concerned, blooming. What no one knew was that she had been planning every single step. Because here's the thing investigators would later discover, after pulling every thread of this story apart. Patricia's journal, the one she'd been keeping since 1997, contained detailed notes. Not just feelings, not just frustrations. Detailed, methodical notes about Douglas's symptoms. Notes about what he ate, what he drank, what supplements she had added to his morning coffee. Notes written in the careful, organized handwriting of a woman who was not acting on impulse. Douglas Marlowe hadn't died of a bacterial infection. He had been poisoned. Slowly, deliberately, over the course of 3 months. And by the time anyone even thought to look, Patricia had already moved on to the next chapter of her carefully constructed life. The years passed. Patricia and Raymond settled into what looked, from the outside, like a comfortable and conventional life. They had a son together, a boy named Caleb, born in 2001. Patricia expanded her catering business. Raymond's contracting work kept them financially stable, and Patricia kept her secrets. She was, by every account, a devoted mother. Caleb adored her. His friends' parents adored her. She brought food to sick neighbors. She organized the 4th of July parade 3 years running. She was the kind of person who made everyone feel vaguely guilty for not doing more. But underneath all of that warmth and competence, Patricia was watching. Always watching. Watching for threats. Watching for anyone who might ask the wrong question. Watching Raymond, the way a chess player watches the board. In 2003, Raymond's mother, Eleanor Marlowe, began making noise. Eleanor had never fully accepted Patricia. Even before the marriage to Douglas, she'd found Patricia too quiet, too composed, too hard to read. And the marriage to Raymond, so soon after Douglas's death, had never sat right with her. She started asking questions. Quietly at first. She mentioned to a neighbor that she sometimes thought Douglas's death had been too sudden. She asked her doctor whether the symptoms Douglas had described to her, symptoms she'd never shared with anyone, could have indicated something other than natural illness. Her doctor didn't know what to make of it. He filed nothing, reported nothing. But Patricia found out. And 3 months after Eleanor Marlowe started asking questions, Eleanor Marlowe had a stroke. She survived. Barely. But the stroke left her unable to speak clearly and almost entirely dependent on a nursing home for care. The questions stopped. Now, I want to be very precise here, because this is where the case gets complicated. Investigators who later reviewed this period could not prove that Patricia had anything to do with Eleanor's stroke. Eleanor was 74 years old. She had high blood pressure and a history of heart disease. A stroke was, medically speaking, not impossible. But Eleanor's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Donna Kraft, remembered something. Something small, the kind of thing that vanishes in the chaos of a medical emergency. She remembered seeing Patricia's car parked outside Eleanor's house the morning Eleanor was found collapsed on her kitchen floor. Patricia had never mentioned that visit to anyone. Not to Raymond. Not to the paramedics. Not to anyone. When investigators would eventually ask her about it, 22 years later, she would say she didn't remember. Life continued. Caleb grew up. Raymond's business struggled and then recovered. Patricia's catering company became genuinely successful. They built a new kitchen extension, took vacations to the coast. From the outside, a happy family. But in 2009, Raymond began to get sick. The same pattern. The same slow, creeping deterioration. Fatigue. Stomach pain. A strange, persistent weakness. Raymond's doctor, a younger physician who had taken over the practice, ran extensive tests. He found nothing conclusive. He suggested stress. He suggested diet changes. He did not connect it to Douglas Marlowe's death 11 years earlier, because why would he? Different decade, different patient, different doctor. Raymond deteriorated through the summer of 2009. By October, he was hospitalized. He died in November. He was 52 years old. And once again, the official cause of death was listed as gastrointestinal failure. Patricia inherited everything. The house, the business assets, a modest life insurance policy, and the Marlowe family property that Raymond had stood to inherit, the same property that had, 11 years earlier, been part of her original calculation. She grieved, publicly and thoroughly, attended grief counseling, spoke openly at the church about loss and faith and the difficulty of being a widow twice over. People felt sorry for her. Some people thought she was cursed. The unluckiest woman in Harlan's Creek. Not a single person suspected her. Not yet. The first real crack came from the most unexpected place. A college student. Caleb Marlowe, Patricia's own son, enrolled at Ohio State in 2019 and took a forensic science elective in his sophomore year. Not because he had any suspicion, just because he thought it sounded interesting. The professor assigned a case study exercise. Students were given anonymized historical medical records and asked to evaluate the cause of death. It was a standard academic exercise designed to teach students how to think critically about forensic evidence. Caleb's assigned case was a man who had died in rural Ohio in the late 1990s of what had been recorded as gastrointestinal failure. Caleb read the file. And then he read it again. And then he sat very, very still for a long time. Because the symptoms described in that file were the same symptoms he remembered his stepfather Raymond describing before he died. The same timeline. The same progression. He mentioned it to his professor, almost as an aside. I've seen something like this before. His professor, a retired state forensic consultant named Dr. Arthur Voss, asked him to say more. Dr. Voss was the kind of man who had spent 30 years watching details that other people missed. He listened to Caleb's account carefully. He asked precise questions. He requested, through proper channels, access to the original death records for both Douglas and Raymond Marlowe. What he found made him sit very, very still. Two brothers. Same town. Same physician practice. Same reported cause of death. Both married, at the time of death, to the same woman. He called a contact at the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And the machine, slow at first, then faster and faster, began to turn. Caleb didn't tell his mother about any of this. He didn't know what he'd found yet. He was a 20-year-old college student, not an investigator. He had raised a question. He had passed it to someone qualified to pursue it. And then he went back to his dorm room and couldn't sleep for 3 nights. The BCI investigation was quiet. Deliberately, painstakingly quiet. They didn't want Patricia to know they were looking. They obtained the original toxicology samples. Both Douglas and Raymond had had samples taken at the time of death, stored as a matter of routine, never seriously re-examined. They sent those samples to an independent laboratory with advanced testing capabilities that hadn't existed in 1998 or 2009. They pulled hospital records, pharmacy records, insurance records. They tracked every prescription, every purchase, every financial transaction Patricia had made in the months before each death. They found the journal. The journal. This is the detail that investigators later described as the most disturbing element of the entire case. Patricia had kept it all. 22 years of carefully kept records, stored in a locked fireproof box in the basement of her home. She had updated it regularly. Detailed entries about Douglas, about Raymond, about Eleanor, about her calculations, her timelines, her reasoning. It read, investigators said, like a project management document. Not emotional, not confessional, not tortured, organized. She had recorded dosages. She had recorded observations. She had noted, with the dispassion of a scientist, what worked and what needed adjustment. And she had recorded something else. Something that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She had written, in an entry dated October 2009, 3 weeks before Raymond's death. He is progressing on schedule. I expect resolution by the end of November. Everything is in order. Investigators now had a decision to make. They had the toxicology results confirming the presence of a toxic compound, a heavy metal, introduced gradually, in amounts consistent with deliberate poisoning, in both Douglas and Raymond's preserved samples. They had the financial records showing Patricia had sole access to household accounts in the months prior to each death. They had the journal. And they had one more thing. A receipt, digitized from an old paper record, from a specialty agricultural supply company, dated February 1998, for a product that, in agricultural use, was legitimate, but which, in the concentrations the lab had found, was lethal. Purchased under Patricia's name. The arrest warrant was issued on a Thursday morning in September 2020, and that is when Patricia Marlowe was standing in her garden, pruning roses, when she saw the police car slowed down in front of her house. She knew. The moment she saw the second car pull up behind the first, she knew. Not because she was caught off guard. Patricia Marlowe was almost never caught off guard. She knew because she had, in the quieter moments of the past 22 years, always understood that this day was theoretically possible. She had simply made peace with the probability being very low. She had trusted the incompetence of small-town record-keeping, the limitations of 1990s toxicology, the passage of time. She had not counted on her own son handing a thread to a forensic scientist who refused to let go of it. The officers were professional. Calm. They did not tell her immediately why they were there. They asked if she would come with them for a conversation. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She asked if she could change her gardening gloves first. They said no. The interrogation lasted 11 hours. Patricia did not break in the way that people imagine criminals break. No dramatic confession, no flood of tears, no collapsing under the weight of guilt. For the first 4 hours, she denied everything. Calmly, methodically. She asked for her attorney, who arrived within the hour, and then she sat quietly while he spoke on her behalf. But then the investigators showed her the toxicology results. And then they showed her the journal. The attorney asked for a recess. Patricia looked at the photocopied pages for a long moment. Her expression, according to the lead detective, did not crumble. It simply went very still, like watching a machine power down. She made a statement the following morning. She did not confess. Not fully. She acknowledged that the journal was hers. She said, and this is almost unbearable to process, that she had made decisions she believed were necessary, that her life had been circumstances she could not endure, that she had done what she had done with full understanding of the consequences, and that she had accepted those consequences as a reasonable trade. Not remorse. Not justification in the way people usually mean. Just accounting. Cold, deliberate accounting. The prosecutor later told journalists that in 20 years of criminal law, she had never sat across from someone so completely devoid of panic. Caleb Marlowe found out what his mother had been charged with on a Friday afternoon via a phone call from his aunt in Harlan's Creek. He sat in his apartment for 2 hours before he called anyone. He would later say, in an interview, that the hardest part wasn't the shock. It was the memory. He had been 8 years old when Raymond died. He remembered his mother sitting beside Raymond's hospital bed, holding his hand. He remembered her crying. Or, he caught himself, in the interview, and corrected the sentence. He remembered her appearing to cry. I don't know anymore, he said. What was real? The trial began in March 2021. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They walked the jury through both deaths chronologically, presenting the toxicology evidence, the financial records, the pharmaceutical trail, and the journal entries. They called Dr. Voss as an expert witness. They called the forensic chemist who had analyzed the preserved samples. And they called Donna Kraft, the retired schoolteacher, now in her late 70s, who climbed carefully into the witness box and told the jury, in a clear and steady voice, that she had seen Patricia's car outside Eleanor Marlowe's house on the morning Eleanor collapsed. The defense argued that the journal was a work of fiction, a form of therapeutic fantasy writing that Patricia had used to process her genuine grief and frustration. They challenged the chain of custody for the toxicology samples. They suggested that the agricultural compound could have entered the system via contaminated well water. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th day, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom, by all accounts, was almost silent. Not the kind of silence that follows a surprise. The kind of silence that settles after a very long wait. Patricia Marlowe stood when the verdict was read. She did not cry. She did not speak. She looked at the jury, and then she looked at her attorney, and then she sat back down. Caleb was not in the courtroom. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted the premeditated and sustained nature of the crimes. He noted the length of time Patricia had concealed her actions. He noted, specifically, that she had continued to live within the community she had harmed, accepted its sympathy, and used its trust as cover. He called it, in his carefully measured judicial language, a profound and sustained betrayal. There are things about this case that investigators say they will never be able to fully answer. Was Eleanor Marlowe's stroke natural, or something else? The evidence was too degraded, too old, too circumstantial to pursue. Patricia was never charged in connection with Eleanor's death, and Eleanor herself passed away in 2012, unable to speak clearly enough to be interviewed. Were there others? Investigators reviewed every death in Patricia's extended social circle over the 22 years in question. They found nothing that rose to the level of prosecution, but several cases were noted as unclear. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, how many people shook her hand at the church bake sale? How many people entrusted her with their children's birthday catering, with their neighbors' casseroles, with their grief? How close does ordinary life run alongside something that looks, from every angle, exactly like ordinary life? Caleb Marlowe gave one public interview, about a year after the trial concluded. He said he didn't think of himself as the person who caught his mother. He said he had simply asked a question. He said Dr. Voss was the one who knew what to do with it. He said he had gone back and forth, in the months before the arrest, about whether he should call her, warn her, give her a chance to. He didn't finish that sentence. He said he had decided, eventually, that he couldn't. Not because he stopped loving her, he said, but because he realized that the woman he loved, the woman who made him breakfast and helped him with homework and sat beside his bed when he was sick, might have been, in some essential way, a performance. And he didn't know what to do with a love that was built on something that might not have been real. I still don't, he said. I'm not sure I ever will. Patricia Marlowe is currently serving her sentence at a correctional facility in Ohio. She has not given any interviews. She has not appealed. She tends a small garden in the facility's outdoor program. This is the part of these stories that stays with me the longest. Not the crimes, not the investigation, but the sheer ordinary texture of the life wrapped around them. The church bake sales, the birthday cakes, the neighbor who waved from across the street, the person who smiles at exactly the right moment and cries at exactly the right moment, and no one ever thinks to look any closer. Because we don't. We don't look closer at the people who seem the most normal. And sometimes, that's exactly what they're counting on. This has been StoryLabs. If this story stayed with you, share it, because these cases only get the attention they deserve when people refuse to look away. Subscribe if you're new here, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.